In just 90 days, something strange began unfolding across America's wilderness. Not in one isolated forest. Not in one small town. But across multiple states, separated by thousands of miles. Ohio. Oklahoma. California. Washington. Montana. The reports kept arriving. Witnesses who had never met each other described the same towering figure. The same unsettling sounds. The same overwhelming feeling that something was watching them from just beyond the trees. Most people focused on the sightings themselves. But investigators became interested in a different question. Why now? Because whatever was happening didn't look random. It looked organized. And when researchers started comparing reports from the first 3 months of 2026, they discovered a pattern that was difficult to ignore. A pattern that may represent one of the largest waves of unexplained encounters ever documented. For years, reported Bigfoot encounters followed a relatively predictable rhythm. A handful of reports each month. Occasional spikes. Then long quiet stretches. Nothing extraordinary. But early in 2026, the numbers began climbing. First gradually. Then suddenly. By March, reports had surged far beyond normal expectations. At first glance, skeptics offered familiar explanations. More cameras. More social media. More people willing to share unusual experiences. Those factors certainly played a role. But researchers noticed something far more significant than the increase itself. The locations. Historically, most reports came from remote wilderness areas, places few people ever visited. Deep forests. Mountain valleys. Backcountry regions far from civilization. But this time was different. The sightings weren't staying deep in the wilderness. They appeared closer to roads. Closer to farms. Closer to communities. Almost as if whatever had once remained hidden was moving toward the edges of human territory. That shift changed everything. Because if the reports were accurate, the question was no longer whether encounters were increasing. The question was why the distance between humans and whatever was being reported seemed to be shrinking. And nowhere illustrated that mystery better than Ohio. Portage County has carried a strange reputation for decades. Long before the recent surge, stories had circulated through local communities. Hunters. Campers. Residents living near wooded areas. Many described seeing something unusually large moving through the forests. Most of those reports received little attention. They never became national headlines. They simply accumulated over time. One story from the 1990s became particularly well known among local researchers. Several teenagers claimed they had been chased through the woods by an enormous upright figure moving with astonishing speed. The account was widely dismissed. Yet reports from the area never completely disappeared. Year after year, new witnesses quietly came forward. Then, in March of 2026, something unusual happened. Within only 4 days, 7 separate witnesses reported encounters inside the same general area. What immediately caught researchers' attention wasn't the number of reports. It was the consistency. None of the witnesses knew one another. Their reports were submitted independently. And according to investigators, the statements were filed before any details became public. When analysts compared the accounts, 3 details appeared again and again. The first was the smell. Every witness described an intense odor. Not the scent of decay. Not the smell of a known predator. Something damp, musky, and distinctly unusual. The second detail was even stranger. A sound. Several witnesses described a deep vibration rather than a traditional noise. Something they felt physically before they consciously heard it. One person later explained that the sensation seemed to resonate through the chest. Others described freezing in place the moment it occurred. Then there was the third detail. Size. Every estimate placed the figure somewhere between 7 and 9 feet tall. 7 unrelated people. 3 identical observations. The same smell. The same sound. The same size. Researchers faced an uncomfortable dilemma. Either a remarkable coincidence had occurred, or multiple people had encountered the same unknown presence moving through that area during the same period. Neither explanation was easy to dismiss. And Ohio was only the beginning. Because hundreds of miles away, another state would soon produce something witnesses alone could not provide. Physical evidence. Evidence found in one of the most rugged landscapes in the country. The forests of southeastern Oklahoma. And what investigators documented there would push the mystery even further. If Ohio raised questions, Oklahoma raised the stakes. Because this time, investigators weren't dealing only with witness testimony. They were dealing with something left behind. Something measurable. Something physical. Southeastern Oklahoma is home to the Kiamishi Mountains, a vast region of dense forests, steep ridges, hidden valleys, and isolated wilderness. To outsiders, Oklahoma may not seem like the kind of place where mysteries survive. But the Kiamishi region is different. Large portions of the landscape remain remarkably untouched. There are areas where a person can walk for hours without seeing another human being. It's a place where wildlife thrives. And where stories have lingered for generations. Long before modern Bigfoot reports existed, indigenous communities living in these mountains spoke of large upright beings inhabiting the forests. These accounts weren't presented as legends. They were treated as practical knowledge, warnings, and observations passed down through generations. For decades, researchers have noted that the region consistently produces a high number of unexplained reports. But during the first months of 2026, something changed. The encounters weren't staying deep inside the wilderness anymore. They were beginning to appear near farms. Near roads. Near places where people lived and worked every day. One report stood out immediately. A local farmer whose property bordered a heavily forested area had spent more than 3 decades working the same land. 31 years. In all that time, he had never reported anything unusual. Then one February morning, shortly after sunrise, he walked toward his barn and noticed something wrong. Part of his fence had been flattened. Not broken. Not climbed over. Not damaged by weather. Flattened. The wooden posts had been forced sideways into the ground as though something extremely powerful had simply moved straight through them. At first, he assumed a vehicle might have caused the damage. But there were no tire tracks. No signs of machinery. Nothing that explained what he was seeing. Then he looked down. The mud around the damaged fence contained a series of impressions. Large impressions. Much larger than human footprints. The tracks measured roughly 18 inches in length. Even more surprising was the distance between them. The stride appeared to exceed 5 feet. Investigators documented the site before weather or human activity could disturb it. Photographs were taken. Measurements were recorded. Researchers examined the impressions carefully. According to their observations, the tracks displayed a natural transfer of weight through each step. Pressure appeared concentrated at the heel before moving forward across the foot. That detail mattered. Artificial tracks often show uniform depth because force is applied directly downward. Natural movement creates a shifting pattern as weight transfers during walking. Researchers noted that these impressions displayed precisely that type of progression. Of course, footprints alone prove nothing. Tracks can be misidentified. They can be fabricated. They can be distorted by environmental conditions. But creating a convincing series of giant prints in a remote field before dawn would already require significant effort. Adding a flattened fence and leaving without being noticed only complicated the explanation further. For investigators, the Oklahoma case represented something important. Not proof, but physical evidence that demanded attention. And while Oklahoma provided tracks in the mud, California would soon provide something even harder to ignore. Sound. Northern California's Redwood Coast contains some of the most ancient forests on Earth. Towering trees block sunlight from reaching the ground. Dense vegetation hides entire sections of wilderness from view. Even modern technology struggles to fully penetrate parts of the landscape. For centuries, these forests have inspired fascination and fear. In March of 2026, 2 experienced hikers entered a section of forest they knew exceptionally well. They weren't tourists. They had camped there regularly for nearly a decade. Storms. Wildlife encounters. Harsh weather. They had experienced it all. Nothing about the location made them nervous. At least not at first. The first 2 nights passed normally. Then came the third night. At exactly 2:17 in the morning, both hikers woke up. Not because of a noise. Because of the silence. The forest had gone completely quiet. No insects. No owls. No movement in the trees. One of them later described it as feeling as though the entire forest had stopped breathing. Then came the sound. A deep vocalization emerged from somewhere beyond the darkness. Neither hiker spoke. Both simply listened. The call didn't resemble anything they had heard before. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't an elk. It wasn't any familiar wildlife sound. The tone rose steadily, held for several seconds, then stopped abruptly. As though whatever produced it had complete control over every aspect of the sound. Moments later, something struck their tent. Then another impact. Then another. Rocks. Branches. Objects landing around them from the darkness. The impacts continued for several minutes. One of the hikers began recording. What the microphone captured would later become one of the most discussed pieces of audio connected to the 2026 surge. Heavy movement could be heard beyond the tent. Branches snapping. Vegetation being pushed aside. Footfalls that sounded deliberate. Powerful. Large. Whatever was moving outside didn't appear concerned about being heard. Then, without warning, everything stopped. No gradual retreat. No fading sounds. Just silence. Complete silence. The following morning, the hikers searched the surrounding area. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. A pine tree roughly 14 inches in diameter had been snapped several feet above the ground. Not uprooted. Not rotten. Not damaged by disease. Snapped cleanly. Fresh wood was exposed at the break point. The upper portion of the tree lay several yards away. When specialists later examined photographs and measurements, they concluded that generating enough force to create such a break would be extraordinarily difficult. No definitive explanation was ever established. But investigators agreed on one thing. The tree, the audio recording, and the events of that night did not fit neatly into any conventional scenario. And as unsettling as California was, the most visually striking evidence of the entire surge was still waiting. Because in Washington state, a wildlife camera would capture 11 seconds of footage that would leave even experienced researchers struggling for answers. By the spring of 2026, investigators were no longer looking at isolated reports. They were looking at a pattern. A pattern stretching across thousands of miles. And Washington would provide one of its most intriguing pieces. On the morning of March 18, a wildlife researcher reviewed footage from a trail camera positioned deep within a remote section of forest. The camera had been installed to monitor animal movement. Nothing unusual. Nothing extraordinary. Just another routine check. Then he noticed something crossing the frame. For only a few seconds, a tall bipedal figure appeared on screen. It moved steadily through the darkness before disappearing back into the trees. The footage was brief. Just 11 seconds. Yet it immediately stood out. The researcher wasn't new to the wilderness. He had spent 2 decades documenting wildlife throughout the Pacific Northwest. Over the years, his cameras had captured bears, wolves, elk, deer, cougars, and countless other species. He knew exactly how each animal appeared on infrared footage. According to his statement, the figure in the recording did not resemble any known wildlife commonly found in the region. That didn't mean he claimed to know what it was. Only that it wasn't something he could easily identify. And sometimes, uncertainty can be more unsettling than certainty. Because unexplained evidence leaves room for possibilities. Some reasonable. Others far less comfortable. Then came Montana. A case that many researchers still describe as one of the most chilling reports connected to the entire surge. Near Flathead Lake, a cabin owner received a motion alert from a security camera during the early hours of the morning. The system activated automatically. Nothing unusual. At least initially. When the footage was reviewed later that day, something unexpected appeared near the tree line. A figure. Standing completely still. Watching. For several minutes, it remained motionless. Not approaching. Not retreating. simply observing the cabin from the darkness. Then an exterior light switched on. Most animals react immediately to sudden illumination. This figure didn't. It showed no visible response. No sign of surprise. No hesitation. After remaining in place for several more moments, it turned and walked back into the forest. Slowly. Calmly. As though it had never been concerned about being seen. The cabin owner later admitted the footage deeply unsettled him. In fact, he reportedly never returned to the property afterward. Whether that decision was driven by fear or simply caution remains unknown. But the recording became another piece of a growing puzzle. A puzzle now spanning 5 different states. 5 different environments. And dozens of independent reports. At this point, researchers began asking a new question. Not whether something unusual was happening, but what could possibly explain it. Several theories emerged, each attempting to make sense of the surge, and each carrying its own unsettling implications. The first explanation focuses on the forests themselves. Across the United States, millions of acres of woodland have disappeared due to development, logging operations, and increasingly severe wildfires. When habitat shrinks, wildlife adapts. This isn't speculation. It's been documented repeatedly with bears, wolves, mountain lions, and other large mammals. Animals don't suddenly decide they want to live closer to people. The landscape simply leaves them fewer alternatives. If an undiscovered species existed in remote wilderness areas, shrinking habitat could naturally force it toward human-adjacent regions. In that scenario, the increase in sightings wouldn't represent a behavioral change. It would represent a geographic one. And that possibility raises an uncomfortable thought. What if this isn't a temporary spike? What if it's the beginning of a new normal? A second theory involves water. When analysts examined decades of sighting reports, one trend appeared again and again. Most encounters occurred surprisingly close to major water sources. Rivers. Creeks. Reservoirs. Lakes. The relationship remained consistent across different states and different decades. Then researchers compared that pattern to the 2026 surge. Nearly every major cluster appeared near significant water systems. At the same time, drought conditions had altered many traditional water routes across parts of North America. Streams weakened. Seasonal sources disappeared. Natural movement corridors changed. If large animals rely heavily on water access, as most known species do, they may have been forced into entirely new travel patterns. Patterns that happen to intersect with human territory far more frequently than before. Again, the explanation didn't require aggression. Or curiosity. Or intentional contact. Only displacement. The third possibility centers on climate. Many large animals follow seasonal migration routes based on temperature, snowfall, and food availability. But the winter preceding the surge was unusual. Snow levels in several western regions fell far below historical averages. Mountain areas that normally remained inaccessible through winter opened weeks earlier than expected. Environmental signals changed. And animals that depended on those signals may have changed with them. Researchers suggested that if movement patterns shifted earlier than normal, encounters with humans would naturally increase. Instead of traveling during periods of minimal human activity, animals could have been moving while hikers, hunters, campers, and trail cameras were already active. The result? More opportunities to be seen. More opportunities to be recorded. More reports. But the fourth theory is the one many researchers discuss most carefully. Because it asks a question few are comfortable considering. What if the change isn't happening because of the environment? What if the change is happening because of behavior? For decades, witness reports have often described something remarkably cautious. Something that seemed capable of avoiding detection. Avoiding cameras. Avoiding roads. Avoiding people. If such a creature existed and possessed that level of awareness, it would also be capable of adaptation. Over time, it would learn. Observe. Adjust. And perhaps reassess risks. If human activity decreases in certain wilderness regions. If negative encounters become increasingly rare. If generations pass without significant threats. Then avoidance behavior could gradually weaken. Not overnight. Not intentionally. But slowly. Over decades. The implication is difficult to ignore. What if the surge isn't evidence of creatures being forced into human territory? What if they are simply becoming less concerned about our presence? Because if that were true, the increase in sightings might not be accidental at all. One final discovery made researchers pause. When decades of reports were analyzed, a specific time window appeared repeatedly. Again and again. Regardless of location. Regardless of terrain. Regardless of year. Most encounters clustered between late evening and early morning. But an even narrower window stood out. A period when human activity reaches its absolute minimum. Road traffic drops. Remote areas become silent. Awareness levels decrease. And most people are asleep. The consistency was remarkable. For decades, whatever generated these reports seemed to operate during the exact period when detection was least likely. That level of consistency suggests more than instinct. It suggests strategy. Observation. Adaptation. Perhaps even an understanding of human behavior itself. Today, the mystery remains unresolved. No single explanation accounts for every report. No theory answers every question. Yet one fact continues to stand out. The sightings are not decreasing. They are increasing. Across forests, mountains, river systems, and isolated communities, reports continue to emerge. Witnesses continue to come forward. And researchers continue searching for answers. Maybe the explanation will ultimately prove ordinary. Maybe every report can be traced back to known causes. Or maybe something else is happening. Something hidden within North America's vast wilderness. Something that has remained beyond our understanding for far longer than anyone realizes. Because perhaps the most unsettling possibility isn't that people are suddenly seeing more of it. It's that whatever has been watching from the forests all this time may no longer be trying quite so hard to stay hidden. And if that's true, the next 90 days could be even stranger than the last.